Most people do not ruin their lives through one dramatic mistake. They ruin them through a single silent way of thinking, repeated so often that it begins to feel like truth. It feels normal, harmless, even logical. And that is why it is so dangerous. Right now, as you listen to these words, there may already be a belief living quietly inside your mind. A belief that life should treat you fairly, that others should understand you without explanation, that time alone will somehow fix what discipline avoids. These thoughts do not hurt immediately. They comfort you at first. They whisper excuses and offer emotional shelter, but slowly, almost invisibly, they weaken your character. Stoic philosophy calls this the loss of inner sovereignty. No one steals your life from you. You hand it over to unexamined thoughts. Picture a man who wakes up each morning with a subtle heaviness in his chest. He cannot name it, so he ignores it. He goes to work, fulfills his duties, exchanges polite smiles, and tells himself that everything is fine. The problem is not his circumstances. The problem is that he believes his inner state is controlled by the outer world. When life does not give him what he expects, he feels wronged. And once a man adopts the mindset of a victim in thought, he begins to live passively in reality. Marcus Aurelius wrote that our life is shaped by the quality of our thoughts. Weak thinking does not stay in the mind. It leaks into action, posture, and choice. The true danger is not failure. It is the belief that you have no authority over how you respond to failure. From that belief, people abandon responsibility over their inner world. They blame the economy, their upbringing, their relationships, their past. And each time they blame something external, they surrender a piece of their power. The Stoics never promised an easy life. They promised a steady mind. Calmness does not come from life becoming lighter. It comes from refusing to let what you cannot control dictate your inner balance. There is a small, almost invisible moment that determines the direction of an entire life. It exists between what happens and what you tell yourself about what happens. Most people live as if these two are the same, as if every event automatically carries emotional authority. This is the way of thinking that quietly destroys lives. Epictetus warned that people are not disturbed by events, but by the judgments they form about those events. Yet because this truth is ignored, the first impulsive thought is allowed to rule the day, the year, the lifetime. When you believe happiness depends on controlling others, tension becomes your permanent companion. When you believe your worth is decided by approval, anxiety follows you everywhere. And when you believe the past defines the future, regret becomes a prison. These beliefs share a single root: misplaced power. The Stoic does not deny emotion, but he does not let emotion steer the ship. He pauses. He observes the thought. Then he asks a simple question: is this within my control? If it is not, he releases it without resentment. If it is, he acts with quiet discipline. Most people are not exhausted because they do too much. They are exhausted because they think too much about what does not deserve their attention. Their minds chase imagined futures, replay old wounds, and argue with realities that cannot be changed. Life, as a result, is lived in constant tension. But the moment you realize that control is not about shaping the world, only about shaping your response to it, something shifts. A door opens inward, and behind that door begins true inner freedom. A freedom no circumstance can take away. At some point, every person reaches a quiet crossroads, not marked by noise or drama, but by a subtle inner realization. This is the moment when life feels heavy, yet nothing appears outwardly broken. You are still functioning, still moving, still doing what is expected. And that is precisely why this moment is so dangerous. The mind begins to whisper that endurance alone is virtue, that tolerating dissatisfaction is maturity, that silence equals strength. Stoic philosophy warns us about this illusion. Endurance without awareness is not strength. It is slow surrender. When a man teaches himself to accept inner disorder as normal, he no longer seeks clarity. He seeks distraction. Most people do not consciously choose misery. They simply delay responsibility for their inner life. They tell themselves that once circumstances change, peace will arrive. Once the job improves, once the relationship stabilizes, once the past stops hurting, then they will feel whole. But the Stoics understood something uncomfortable. External change rarely heals internal confusion. If the mind remains undisciplined, no favorable outcome will ever feel sufficient. The danger lies in believing that time, rather than character, is the solution. Time only reveals what has been cultivated within. A person who avoids examining his thoughts begins to live reactively. He is pulled by praise and pushed by criticism. His emotions rise and fall based on forces he does not command. Over time, this erodes self-respect, not because he fails publicly, but because he knows privately that he is not steering his own life. Seneca wrote that the greatest form of slavery is being a prisoner of one's own emotions, and yet this prison has no visible bars. It is built entirely of unchecked assumptions. Assumptions about fairness, recognition, and control. The Stoic path does not demand emotional suppression. It demands emotional literacy. It asks you to slow down enough to notice the first impulse, the immediate judgment, the reflexive story the mind tells. Most suffering begins here. A thought arises unchallenged and becomes a belief. That belief hardens into identity, and identity once formed unconsciously governs behavior for decades. This is how lives drift far from intention without a single dramatic mistake. There is a turning point hidden inside every difficult moment, a pause so brief that it is often missed. This pause is not passive, it is active restraint. It is the decision to not immediately agree with the mind's first conclusion. Stoic philosophy places enormous power in this space. Between stimulus and response lies freedom, not the loud freedom of rebellion, but the quiet freedom of choice. When a person learns to protect this space, he begins to reclaim authority over his life. Consider what happens when disappointment appears. The untrained mind rushes to meaning. I am unlucky. I am unworthy. This always happens to me. The Stoic mind interrupts this pattern. It asks, is this judgment useful or merely familiar? Is this within my control, or am I demanding power where none exists? This questioning does not eliminate pain. It prevents pain from becoming poison. The difference is subtle but profound. Pain is unavoidable. Suffering is optional. When a man practices this discipline consistently, his relationship with reality changes. He no longer needs events to validate him. Success does not inflate his identity, and failure does not destroy it. He understands that outcomes are temporary, but character is cumulative. Each moment of restraint strengthens the mind. Each refusal to catastrophize builds stability. Over time, others may notice his calm, but the real transformation happens unseen. The Stoics believed that tranquility is earned, not granted. It is the result of repeated alignment between values and action. This alignment does not require perfection. It requires honesty, an honest acknowledgement of what is within one's control, thoughts, judgments, effort, and what is not, outcomes, opinions, fate. When this distinction becomes clear, anxiety loses much of its power. The mind stops arguing with reality and begins cooperating with it. Most people exhaust themselves trying to manage the uncontrollable. The Stoic conserves energy by focusing inward. He understands that a disciplined inner world creates resilience against an unpredictable outer one. This is not indifference, it is clarity. And clarity brings a quiet confidence that does not depend on applause or certainty. The transformation begins the moment you stop asking life to be easier and start asking yourself to be steadier. From that shift, strength grows naturally, calm becomes durable, and freedom, no longer fragile, takes root inside the only place it has ever belonged, the mind. As awareness deepens, a new discomfort often appears, not the sharp pain of crisis, but the quieter unease of responsibility. At this stage, a person can no longer honestly say, "I didn't know." The patterns are visible now. The habits of thought that once operated in the background have stepped into the light. And this is where many retreat, not because the path is unclear, but because it demands consistency. Stoic philosophy teaches that clarity is not the end of struggle. It is the beginning of discipline. When you realize that your reactions are yours to govern, excuses lose their power. You can no longer blame temperament, history, or circumstance without sensing the lie underneath. This realization is liberating, but it is also heavy. Freedom carries weight. It requires effort where avoidance once lived. The mind, accustomed to drifting, resists this change. It seeks comfort in old narratives. This is just who I am. Change takes too much energy. I'll start tomorrow. These thoughts are subtle forms of self-betrayal. The Stoics warned against confusing insight with action. Understanding what must be done does not strengthen character. Doing it repeatedly does. A man may clearly see that anger harms him, yet still indulge it. He may recognize that fear limits his growth, yet still obey it. Knowledge alone does not transform. Only applied reason does. This is why Epictetus emphasized practice over philosophy as performance. Wisdom that is not lived is merely decoration for the ego. At this stage, the true battle shifts inward. It is no longer about identifying what is wrong, but about choosing what is right when it feels uncomfortable. The mind begins to negotiate. It asks for exceptions. It seeks shortcuts. But discipline does not respond to negotiation. It responds to commitment. The Stoic learns to act according to principle, not mood. He understands that emotions are weather, not direction. If he waits to feel ready, he may wait forever. Consistency is unglamorous. It produces no immediate applause, yet it is the quiet force that reshapes identity. Each small, deliberate response builds trust with oneself. Each refusal to indulge impulse strengthens inner alignment. Over time, this alignment creates stability that no external validation can replace. As discipline takes root, something subtle but profound changes in how life is experienced. Events still occur, challenges still arise, loss and uncertainty do not disappear, but they no longer dominate the inner landscape. The Stoic begins to move through life with a grounded presence. He does not rush to label experiences as good or bad. He observes first. This pause creates space, and space creates choice. Where once there was immediate reaction, there is now measured response. Where there was emotional turbulence, there is now clarity. This does not mean the absence of feeling. It means feeling without surrender. The Stoics believed that emotions are natural signals, but poor masters. When guided by reason, they inform rather than control. This relationship transforms suffering into instruction. A disciplined mind no longer seeks certainty from the future. It finds sufficiency in the present effort. Success is approached with humility, failure with composure. Neither is allowed to define identity. The individual understands that outcomes belong partly to fate, but effort belongs entirely to him. This distinction dissolves much of anxiety. Worry loses its grip when control is properly assigned. At this stage, the mind becomes quieter, not because thoughts disappear, but because unnecessary ones are dismissed more easily. Energy once wasted on resentment, comparison, and fear is redirected toward purposeful action. Life feels simpler, though not easier. Simplicity is the byproduct of alignment. Ease is not guaranteed. The Stoic does not measure progress by external milestones, but by inner steadiness. He notices that provocations have less power, that silence no longer feels empty, that solitude becomes restorative rather than threatening. These are signs of inner consolidation, the mind learning to rest within itself. This stage is not an endpoint. It is a foundation. Discipline, once established, must be maintained. Complacency invites regression. The Stoics never promised permanent tranquility. They promised a method to return to it. Each day becomes a renewed practice of attention, restraint, and choice. The reward is not perfection, but reliability. A mind that can be trusted, a character that does not fracture under pressure, and a life guided less by impulse, more by intention. This is the quiet power of Stoic discipline, invisible to most, transformative to those who commit to it fully. At this stage of the journey, the struggle no longer feels internal alone. It becomes social, environmental, and subtle. The disciplined mind now meets resistance from the world. Not loud opposition, but quiet pressure, expectations, norms, unspoken rules about how one should think, feel, and behave. This is where many falter, not because they lack strength, but because they underestimate how persuasive collective habits can be. Stoic philosophy teaches that the greatest test of inner stability is not solitude, but interaction. When a person begins to live by principle rather than impulse, he becomes slightly out of sync with his surroundings. He does not react as quickly. He does not complain as easily. He does not seek validation as openly. This difference attracts attention. Some admire it, many misunderstand it, and a few resist it. The disciplined individual may be labeled distant, cold, or indifferent. These labels are tempting traps. The mind wants to explain itself, to defend its choices, to be understood. But the Stoic recognizes a deeper truth. Clarity does not require consensus. Social pressure works by appealing to emotion. It suggests that peace depends on approval, that belonging requires conformity. The Stoics warn that surrendering judgment to the crowd is one of the fastest ways to lose oneself. A person who measures his worth by external reaction becomes fragmented. He adjusts his values depending on the room he is in. Over time, this erodes inner coherence. What begins as flexibility becomes inconsistency, and inconsistency weakens character. At this stage, the challenge is not knowing what is right, but continuing to do it while being questioned, ignored, or subtly discouraged. The mind may ask, is this discipline worth the isolation? Is this restraint making life smaller? These doubts are natural. Even the Stoics acknowledged the human desire for connection, but they also understood that connection without integrity is hollow. A man who abandons his principles to avoid discomfort pays a high price later: regret. Stoic discipline does not reject society. It rejects dependence on it. The individual learns to engage without attachment. He participates but does not surrender authorship of his inner state. Praise does not inflate him. Criticism does not define him. He listens carefully but chooses deliberately. This balance is difficult. It requires ongoing vigilance. Social environments constantly invite reaction. The Stoic constantly returns to pause. As the mind strengthens against external pressure, a new form of calm emerges. It is quieter than confidence, steadier than motivation. It is self-trust. This trust is not built on success, but on consistency. The individual knows that regardless of circumstance, his response will be guided by principle. This knowledge changes how he moves through the world. He no longer needs to announce his values. They are visible in his restraint. At this stage, temptations become more refined. They are no longer obvious distractions, but rationalized compromises, small exceptions, harmless indulgences, socially acceptable shortcuts. The Stoic treats these moments seriously. He understands that character is not destroyed by major failures alone, but by repeated minor concessions. Each time a principle is bent for comfort, it becomes easier to bend again. Discipline weakens quietly. To counter this, the Stoic practices deliberate reaffirmation. He revisits his values regularly. He reflects not to criticize himself, but to recalibrate. Reflection becomes maintenance, not punishment. This habit keeps the inner compass aligned. The mind stays oriented even when conditions change. Another shift occurs here. The Stoic stops expecting life to reward virtue immediately. He releases the belief that good conduct guarantees good outcomes. This release brings freedom. When action is no longer transactional, disappointment loses much of its sting. The individual acts well because it is aligned with who he chooses to be, not because he expects applause. This stage also deepens compassion. Having faced his own impulses, the Stoic recognizes them in others. He becomes less reactive to human behavior. Anger softens into understanding. Judgment gives way to patience. This does not mean tolerance of harm. It means clarity without hostility. The Stoic can set boundaries without resentment. Life at this stage feels quieter but fuller, less dramatic but more stable. The inner world is no longer crowded with argument. Decisions feel simpler, not because options disappear, but because values filter them. The Stoic no longer asks, "What will make me feel good right now?" He asks, "What response is consistent with my character?" This is not detachment from life. It is deeper engagement without entanglement. The Stoics believed that the highest form of freedom is the ability to act rightly regardless of circumstance. At this stage, that freedom begins to feel real, not perfect, not permanent, but reliable. The mind learns to stand alone without becoming isolated, to engage without being absorbed, to move forward without being pushed. This balance is rare. It is earned slowly, and it prepares the ground for the final stages of mastery, where wisdom becomes not effortful, but embodied. At this stage, the struggle changes its shape once again. It becomes quieter, more subtle, and therefore easier to underestimate. The mind is no longer pulled violently by impulse or shaken by social pressure. Instead, it faces something more difficult: acceptance. Acceptance of limits. Acceptance of uncertainty. Acceptance of outcomes that do not align with preference. Stoic philosophy teaches that this is where many disciplined individuals stumble, not because they lack control, but because they still cling to expectation. Expectation is a refined attachment. It disguises itself as hope, fairness, or logic. The mind says, "I have acted rightly, therefore life should respond accordingly." But the Stoics warn that this belief binds inner peace to external events. A person may act with virtue and still encounter loss. He may exercise restraint and still be misunderstood. He may choose integrity and still face discomfort. When expectation remains, disappointment returns quietly. At this stage, the individual must learn the difference between effort and outcome. Effort belongs to him. Outcome does not. This distinction is simple in theory, but demanding in practice. The mind resists releasing its claim on results. It wants reassurance. It wants confirmation that discipline is working. When confirmation does not arrive, doubt whispers again. The Stoic does not silence this doubt through force. He examines it. He asks whether it is reasonable to demand certainty from a world governed by change. Acceptance in Stoic terms is not resignation. It is alignment with reality. It means seeing events as they are, without layering them with unnecessary judgment. This skill requires humility. The humility to admit that control has limits. The humility to recognize that not every outcome is personal. As this humility deepens, resistance softens. The mind stops arguing with life. And when argument fades, energy returns. Many people fear acceptance because they believe it leads to passivity. The Stoics taught the opposite. Acceptance clears perception. It allows action to arise from clarity rather than frustration. When a person stops fighting what cannot be changed, he gains strength to influence what can. This is the paradox of surrender. It restores power. As acceptance settles in, the inner world becomes noticeably lighter, not because problems disappear, but because they are no longer multiplied by mental resistance. The Stoic begins to experience a calm that does not depend on circumstances aligning. This calm is not indifference, it is spaciousness. There is room between stimulus and reaction, room between desire and decision. In that space, wisdom breathes. At this stage, the individual develops a different relationship with time. He stops rushing toward imagined futures and replaying altered pasts. Attention anchors more often in the present moment. not as a technique, but as a natural consequence of reduced mental noise. When the mind no longer demands control over everything, it relaxes its grip. Presence emerges effortlessly. The Stoics believed that true freedom appears when a person wants what happens, rather than insisting that what happens should match his wants. This does not mean blind optimism. It means flexible consent to reality. When circumstances change, the Stoic adapts without bitterness. He understands that rigidity belongs to ego, not strength. Strength lies in responsiveness. Another transformation occurs here. Gratitude becomes quieter and deeper. It is no longer tied to favorable events alone. Gratitude expands to include challenges, delays, and even losses, not because they are pleasant, but because they refine character. The Stoic recognizes difficulty as instruction. Each obstacle becomes a test of alignment rather than a personal attack. At this stage, emotional balance stabilizes. Joy is calmer. Sadness is cleaner. Anger fades faster. The mind no longer exaggerates experience. It feels fully, but briefly. Emotions pass through rather than taking residence. This fluidity brings relief. Life feels less heavy. Even when circumstances are unchanged, acceptance also reshapes relationships. The Stoic stops expecting others to fulfill internal needs. He appreciates without clinging. He sets boundaries without hostility. He allows people to be as they are, while remaining responsible for his own conduct. This reduces conflict dramatically. Peace spreads outward from inner order. The Stoics taught that harmony with nature is the final measure of wisdom. Nature, in this sense, includes uncertainty, impermanence, and limitation. When the mind stops resisting these facts, it stops exhausting itself. Action becomes simpler, decisions become cleaner. The individual no longer seeks to dominate life, only to cooperate with it. This stage prepares the ground for something rare, quiet joy, not excitement, not pleasure, but a steady appreciation of being alive without the need to control the script. The Stoic walks forward with less tension, fewer demands, and greater trust. Not trust in outcomes, but trust in his ability to respond with integrity. Here, acceptance completes the circle. Discipline builds strength. Clarity builds direction. Acceptance builds peace. And peace, once rooted, becomes the foundation for the final stage. Living wisdom not as effort, but as a natural state of being. At the final stage of this journey, wisdom no longer feels like something you reach for. It feels like something you rest within. The Stoics described this state not as victory, but as harmony. Harmony between thought and action, between intention and response, between the self and the unfolding of life. Nothing outside has become easier. Circumstances remain uncertain. People remain unpredictable. Loss, delay, and discomfort still appear. What has changed is the relationship with them. The mind no longer tightens when events diverge from preference. It no longer rushes to correct reality. There is a quiet understanding now that resistance is optional. Action still happens, but without inner conflict. Decisions arise from clarity rather than fear. When effort is required, it is given fully. When waiting is wiser, patience does not feel like punishment. This is not passivity. It is intelligent alignment. At this stage, principles have become instinct. The Stoic does not debate his values each morning. They are already integrated. Integrity guides behavior without conscious strain. Discipline no longer feels rigid. It feels rhythmic, like breathing. It supports life rather than constraining it. This is the reward of long consistency, character that carries itself. Uncertainty, once a source of anxiety, now feels familiar. The Stoic understands that life was never meant to be predictable. He stops demanding guarantees from a world defined by change. Instead of seeking control, he cultivates readiness. Readiness to adapt. Readiness to endure. Readiness to respond well regardless of outcome. This readiness creates confidence that is quiet but durable. Speech changes at this stage. Words become fewer but clearer. There is no urgency to explain oneself, no hunger to persuade. Silence becomes comfortable, even nourishing. In silence, the Stoic listens more deeply, to others and to himself. Presence replaces performance. Compassion also matures here. Having faced his own fears and contradictions, the Stoic recognizes them in others. Anger softens into understanding. Judgment gives way to discernment. This does not mean tolerating harm or abandoning boundaries. It means acting without hatred, correcting without contempt, walking away without bitterness. Life now feels simpler, though not smaller. Complexity still exists, but it no longer overwhelms the inner world. The Stoic can hold joy without clinging, and sorrow without collapse. Emotions arise, move, and pass. They inform, but they do not command. Recovery from disturbance becomes quicker. The mind knows the way back to center. At this stage, success and failure lose their power to define identity. Praise does not inflate. Criticism does not destabilize. The Stoic measures progress differently now, not by outcomes, but by steadiness. Not by recognition, but by coherence between values and action. This coherence creates self-trust, and self-trust creates peace. The Stoics believed that the highest wisdom is living according to one's nature as a rational and social being. This means acting with reason, fairness, and courage, even when it is inconvenient. At this stage, virtue is no longer aspirational, it is habitual. The individual does not wonder who he is under pressure. He remains recognizable to himself. This is not an ending, it is a stable beginning. Life will continue to test, surprise, and challenge. The difference is that the Stoic no longer fears these movements. He has learned how to return to clarity. He knows where his power resides, not in controlling events, but in governing response. Wisdom, in the Stoic sense, is not brilliance, it is reliability. The ability to remain steady when conditions are unstable, to choose what is right when it is uncomfortable, to accept what cannot be changed, and to shape what can be shaped without confusion between the two. If this journey has spoken to you, if you recognized your own struggles, growth, or quiet aspirations within these words, then allow that recognition to become action. Like this video if it brought you clarity. Comment with the insight that stayed with you the longest, and share it with someone who may be walking this path in silence.